word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. Let these words, let our meditations, let our actions proclaim your word today. Amen. When I was on the program staff at Naramata Center from 1992 to 97, I joined a handful of senior staffers who took turns coordinating a week of summer programs on the 23-acre site comprising a variety of program spaces, campsites, accommodations, beachfront, orchards of cherries and apples. It was the United Church's Retreat Center running right up the center of the village of Naramata in the Okanagan Valley. How many have been there? It's quite a spectacular place. It's actually holy ground. It's one of those, the Celts described thin places where the veil between this world and the next is thin, really thin. Naramata's like that. A typical summer week had the rhythm of an early morning gathering at the fire pit for worship, followed by all ages programming, adults to infants, varying different topics and programs. In the afternoon, the 300 people on site would be in different places. They'd be at the beach swimming, they might be checking out the wineries, but it would be this kind of hangout time. And then in the evenings, there would be community gatherings, singing or storytelling or various groups showing off what they'd done in the morning. It was that kind of thing, fairs, stuff like that. I remember one week I acted in the role of music resource, animating the singing when the community gathered. So at worship I would be the song leader, and in worship I'd be the song leader, and at night we'd gather around singing and I would be the song leader, while my colleague, Tim Scorer, coordinated the week. It was the center's practice for coordinators to gather with the adult leaders, well, anybody who was offering leadership that week, after lunch, just to say, how was your morning? What's happening in your group? What do we need to do in the community time to kind of knit this community together? So we gather after lunch and we reflect on what the community needed, and we talk about what happened in the morning. Tim was a skilled facilitator. He is gifted, he's creative, he's compassionate, he's adaptable, he responds, he reads groups really, really well. His work in the church is highly respected. And here I am, 20 years later, able to call him my colleague and my friend. He's just a cool guy. So during this particular week that I was music resource and Tim was coordinating, Tim had to handle a week of very difficult circumstances. I don't remember whether it was a bunch of teens that were some of them were differently able, with disabilities, some had autism, whatever that stuff. And when that comes together in a whole new crowd, the whole community kind of pivots and tries to hold it, right? So Tim had to do all of that, and we were all affected as leaders by those programs. We, as leaders, recognized Tim's capacity to support the whole leadership team as this great container while we each dealt with the respective issues that showed up that week. And so at the end of the week, at the last meeting of the group after lunch, it was a time for appreciations and kind of reflections. And at the end of this meeting, one of our adult leaders presented Tim with a clerical stole as a thank you. Those of you, in the Christian tradition, the stole is often only worn, or some say carried, by those who are ordained. So it was a bit of a precedent-setting moment when Tim, a lay leader, was presented with a liturgical stole. The one presenting the stole spoke of Tim's capacity as this community's pastor and priest, expressing the community's deep appreciation for having been so held while we faced what we faced. Tim told me later that in that moment, he actually felt like he'd been ordained, called and set apart by this particular community as he filled his role so courageously and compassionately. It was an entirely appropriate gesture. And all of the ordained ministers sitting in that leadership circle agreed completely. Tim had become our pastor and our priest. So it was entirely appropriate that we ordain him to that role. I'm reminded of this experience as I reflect on the coronation of David by the leaders of the tribes of Israel. David has already conquered the southern kingdom, Judah, having won many battles with the Philistines and the other warring tribes. The leaders of the north, Israel, recognized David's, well, maybe they recognized that perhaps they would be stronger together as a united country, economically and politically, than if they were continued to be disparate. And so they gather to unite under one leader. They come to David as his kin. Remember, we are your family. Remember that line that Myrna, we are your family and your offspring. They came as kin, recognizing David, and then they did what God had already done. They anointed David. They anointed David, uniting the country for the first time. There's no scepter, there's no crown, there's no kind of royal robe. There's only an anointing. How many times have we anointed each other here? This is as much a liturgical moment as it is a political action. Because what's happening is they're maintaining the supremacy of God. But what are we faced with as David's first action? He goes to war. He goes to Jerusalem to wipe out the Jebusites who are holding the city. And do you know where he goes? In the most vulnerable place of Jerusalem. He goes up the water source. That whole reflection of water, the water shaft, that's the water source for Jerusalem. And all of the soldiers get in that way. That's how they get in and take the cities, through the water source. And what does he do for God? He captures the city for God. He sets the platform for the temple to be built under his son. He builds his own palace, and he reigns for 4 years. He slaughters the Jebusites and brings it under the unity of the country for God. The folks at Waves had a heyday with David yesterday. We were actually noisier than the running club. And there's 50 of them. They were pretty animated. I don't think they liked David much. And besides, what does this brutal, murderous bully have to do with effective leadership anyway? Right? Awesome questions. In some versions of the lectionary gatherers suggest that we don't read the bits about the lame and the blind getting access to the house. Right? It's as if the lectionary gatherers don't want us to explore the very nature of humankind at its ugliest. Like, we want to set apart, we want to keep the pretty bits, and we don't want to be fully human. Right? It's as if they want to gloss over that David had been and could continue to be ruthless in his desire to win the land for God. This is the same David that history also remembers as a crafty statesman, a creative poet and practiced musician, a compassionate friend, an ardent lover. Yep, David was also ruthless. So it must not go unnoticed that all things human happen in the Bible. All things human happen in the church. All things human happen in leadership. In fact, that's likely the most important aspect or the most important job in leadership, is to show up human. Let me say that again. The most important job in leadership is to show up human. To show up in the fullness of who you are. in the face of any given situation. That's what leaders do. The most effective leaders are grounded in their own personhood, bringing all of who they are, showing up as authentically as they can be, bringing the spiritual gifts that they've been gifted by God, and generously offering them and themselves before whatever situation is before them. That's what leaders are. We can't forget that the David narrative, this story that we're reading in 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, has been recorded by the Deuteronomistic historians, the former royal scribes of the time, writing when they're being held hostage in Babylon 400 years after David actually lived. So here they are in Babylonian captivity, held hostage. Well, their friends, not even friends, but their people who used to work the land, are working the land for the Babylonian king. So those folks are held in house arrest, working for the Babylonian king, while the scribes, the elite, are held in hostage, not in their country. In the worldview of these historians, and what they're doing is here, casting their eyes back on the stories of David 400 years earlier, and they're rewriting history through the lens of a powerful God. Because their God, in their worldview, you see, these historians in their worldview believed that what was happening to them, this Babylonian captivity, this history, had already happened to God in heaven. God had been defeated by the Babylonian gods, and it got played out on earth. That's what they believed. And so, they had to help the people remember the time, in this horrible time, when God was in charge. Remember the time. And David then could do nothing without God. They were in sync. They were total in alignment. The historians are helping those people remember that time. So I bring my attention now to the circle way of meeting. The idea that there is a leader in every chair, every single one of you. I'll admit that David's ruthless bullying may not be a model for us to sit in the circle. In fact, it's probably not particularly helpful. But we can notice David's devotion to God. Right? We can notice that. And we can notice David's willingness to bring all of who he is. His poetry, his ruthlessness, his compassion, his strategic mind. He brings all of that and says yes to God. So what happens when each of us does that in the circle as a leader in every chair? What happens? I show up just who I am. Myrna shows up, Irene shows up, Elmer shows up, exactly who we are in the circle. We bring all of who we are and we just offer it. The tribes of Israel gave up their allegiance to David, right? Well, in the circle, when each of us shows up, the idea of allegiance dances. We give up our allegiance. So Alice might say something. Alice, I never thought of that before. We give our allegiance to that idea while she expresses that. And then another person dances with their powers. They say, you know, I like that idea, but here's what I'm thinking about. So Kathy's just said that. All of a sudden, our allegiance shifts to Kathy. And we give that up. Oh, and in the circle, Shauna says, I'm really uncomfortable with that kind of change. And she stands in exactly where she's at in the circle. She brings what she brings. And all of a sudden, we can be with Shauna. We give up our allegiance. We give our allegiance to Shauna's vulnerability in that moment.
right? Do you see this dance? There's this dance of power in the circle. And do you see how powerful the circle is? Because we can dance together, and it moves and shifts. And the circle is strong because each of us has stood in relationship with the God we know, in alignment, perfect alignment, while the others do also. And each of us drops in and trusts. Did you hear that word? And trusts what each of us drops in and lays in. And what happens in that moment is that all of it gets held in circle, and from the circle, in perfect alignment with who we believe God to be. God's in charge here. We see something none of us could ever have seen without us. And it grows from there. Without us becoming all of who we are, without us all letting go or stop withholding and just being present and fully who we are, without that, we will not move. With that, oh my goodness, we pull together. What if we did that? What if we actually did that? You know, God is at the heart of this shared power. We can do nothing without God either, just like David. We cannot do it without that. Now, what if we gave up our allegiance to God and each other as we danced in this power together? What if we made a covenant with each other in this moment that that's what we're going to do? A covenant puts God as one of the players. What if we did that? Covenant means we can't let go. Covenant means, when I say yes to the covenant, it means that I can't step out of the circle because I've made a covenant, and God's at the heart of that promise. Oh, that means we can't do anything but stay in circle and continue to do this dance of allegiance while something emerges. What if? Sounds like fun to me.